In this PowerPoint, I would like to talk through some of the key issues related to New Testament eschatology. First of all, the word eschatology is a fancy theological term for the doctrine of the last things. And under that category, people will often talk about death, what happens after death, about final judgment, about the nature of heaven and hell. That's not so much what my concern is at this point, because another aspect of eschatology is related to what exactly do we anticipate in the future, both in terms of the nature and the timing of the return of Christ and the establishment or the completion, the consummation of God's kingdom. Clearly that topic overlaps somewhat with other aspects of eschatology, but I do want to limit myself to that specific part of it in this conversation. Some of the basic assumptions of futuristic thinking or thinking about eschatology in the New Testament are in the first place, we're talking about an already not yet kingdom. That becomes clear in the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels. In some ways, that kingdom, the kingdom of God that Jesus announced, was announced as present, as already effective, at work in the world, especially through Jesus' ministry and through the proclamation of the gospel, but at the same time as a kingdom also partly future. The consummation of the kingdom, the complete establishment of the reign of Christ did not occur with his first coming, but the New Testament says that it will occur with his return at the end of the age. So when we talk about eschatology, we're talking about the kingdom, and we're acknowledging both its presence and its present incompleteness. We long for and wait for and hope for the day when Christ will come again to establish his kingdom forever. A second assumption is that apocalyptic texts, I'll explain that word in just a minute, are not to be taken as though they somehow describe literal events in world history on the basis of which we can sketch out exactly when and how the end of the age will occur. In the New Testament, we have a fairly small sample of what's called apocalyptic texts. It was actually a fairly common literary form in the centuries prior to and during the time of Jesus, but we find it in the New Testament really mostly in the book of Revelation, and to a much smaller extent in a couple of chapters within the Gospels. Apocalyptic texts use a very specific form of literature in order to emphasize certain things about eschatology. It uses symbolism, in part, to help us understand that we don't know exactly what these things will look like in their final fulfillment, and so they can only be described in symbols. It also uses the form of sequences of events, all under the control of God, but not designed so that we can sketch out on a literal calendar exactly what happens next, and therefore predict how far along we are on this calendar. So all those throughout church history who have thought they could use these texts to come up with some plausible guess as to when Christ would return have not only been wrong in what they've guessed, but also wrong in how they're using the text. They were not designed for that purpose. It's an art form, it's a way of communicating theological points, but it's not designed to create calendars. When we turn specifically to the book of Revelation, we need to pay attention to the name of the book. In our Bibles it's called Revelation, but if you read the first verse, it says the revelation of Jesus, which God gave to John. And so what the book of Revelation really is a way of presenting Jesus. Jesus is presented in the first chapter with a vision, a symbolic picturing of who Jesus is. Jesus is presented in chapters 2 and 3 as the Lord of the church, who instructs and encourages and challenges the church. Jesus is presented in chapters 4 and 5 as the victorious slain lamb who is worthy of our worship, and so on. As we work our way through the book of Revelation, we're tempted to get lost in the symbols, or we're tempted to think we've finally gotten the sequences all figured out, but we're looking for the wrong things if we're not watching for a revelation of Jesus, a revelation of what Jesus is like, what Jesus has done for us, and what Jesus will finally accomplish through the new heaven and the new earth. There's in fact a commentary on the book of Revelation that's called The Most Revealing Book in the Bible by Bernard Eller, a fascinating book in which he argues in every single text in Revelation, the most important question to ask is, how does this text reveal Jesus? One more piece on basic assumptions. We often talk about the last days or the end of the age and so on, and many people who use expressions like that believe that it refers to the very last days of the entire age of the church. But if you look in the scriptures, that expression actually refers to the entire period of the church age. For example, in his sermon on the day of Pentecost, Peter talks about how that event fulfills the prophecies, and therefore in these last days God's Spirit has been poured out. We see the same thing in the first couple of verses of Hebrews. When the New Testament says last days, it doesn't mean the very final years and decades of church history. It means the entire time period from Pentecost to the end of the age. So if anyone asks you, do you think we're living in the last days? A good answer is yes, I believe we've been doing that for almost 2,000 years already. I mentioned that Revelation is the primary apocalyptic literature of the New Testament, but there are chapters in the Gospels which also speak of the end of the age. Some of our Bibles actually give them a title like Signs of the End of the Age, and one of those, at least, is Mark chapter 13. That's the chapter on which I wrote my doctoral dissertation, so it's the one that I probably have spent the most time paying close attention to. The gist of the chapter is approximately like this. Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. The disciples presumably assume that when the temple falls, that must mean that the end of the age has come. And so they ask a question about what are the signs that this is all about to be fulfilled. And it's clear that they're thinking about the end of the world. Jesus then gives a fairly long speech in response to their question, but that doesn't mean that he answers their question. Many have assumed that if they ask about signs, then whatever Jesus says next must be the signs that they were hoping that he would tell them. And so the chapter has often been interpreted that way. Jesus begins by warning against false teachers, about talking about wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines. And a fairly common reading of that chapter is to start listing these things as though these are the signs. So what are the signs? And Jesus says, well, there's going to be false teachers, and there will be earthquakes, there will be famines, there will be wars and rumors of wars. And so we start our long list of signs. But Jesus, in fact, doesn't ever call any of these things signs. In this chapter, he actually does the opposite. He says, when these things start happening, don't start getting all excited as though this is the end of the age. This is not the end of the age. These are the kinds of things that represent the beginning of this long period of waiting for the Son of Man to come back. In fact, it characterizes the entire time period. Within Mark 13, the word signs actually does show up, but it shows up only once, and that's in verse 22. Interestingly, in a verse that says, watch out for those people who give signs, because they're going to deceive people. So in Mark chapter 13, it doesn't seem at all obvious to me that what Jesus is providing is a set of signs by means of which we'll be able to predict the timing of the end of the age. I think it's almost exactly the opposite. Jesus is saying, you want signs? You want to create a calendar? Well, let me tell you what your preoccupation should be instead. You should recognize that in all of world history, however short or long that is, there will be challenges, there will be difficulties, there will be persecution. Your job is not to watch for signs, not to create calendars, but rather to learn to be discerning, to learn to be faithful, to spread the good word of the gospel of salvation, and so on. So when Jesus says watch, he mostly doesn't mean watch for signs. He means watch out for deceivers, watch for the true meaning of what's going on, watch out about your own discipleship. In fact, I think that probably verse 32 of Mark 13 is its primary message. In verse 32, Jesus says, "But about that day or hour nobody knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." The most natural reading is that everybody, including the angels, including Jesus for that matter, is, or at least was at the time Jesus was saying these words, unaware of exactly when God the Father would choose to wrap up world history. We don't know the day, we don't know the hour, the week, the month, the year, or the generation. We simply live in faithfulness throughout all the time, the period of waiting until the Son of Man returns. Of course, there's far more that could be said about this intriguing chapter. Those who would be interested in pursuing it further can do so in my commentary on the Book of Mark. Turning our attention specifically to the Book of Revelation, probably the first question, the most important question, is exactly what sort of book is this? I've already referred to the most revealing book in the Bible by Bernard Eller. That's his take on the book. Revelation reveals Jesus. It doesn't reveal timetables. It doesn't reveal who is the Antichrist. By the way, Antichrist doesn't even appear in the book of Revelation, contrary to many people's thinking. What it does instead is teach us that God is in control of history, that evil will not last forever, that God will be the final victor, that God, through the slain Lamb, who is Jesus Christ, rules and does so on behalf of and with those who are faithful followers of Jesus, and at the end of the age, God's kingdom will be established forever. All of that is taught in a book that really is a combination of three different kinds of biblical literature, three different genres, if you like. Number one, it's apocalypse. That's the kind of literature that focuses on God's interventions from outside of history. It uses visions and dreams and coded symbolic speech in order to reveal its basic lessons. But the book is not pure apocalypse. It combines that literary style with another kind, which we know very much of from the Old Testament, and that is prophetic literature. Prophecy not only in terms of predicting things that are yet to come, but preaching, proclaiming, announcing the good news, announcing its implications for now, announcing its challenge to be faithful as followers of Jesus. And as we look closely into the book of Revelation, we discover also epistle, or letters to churches. Some people have interpreted the book of Revelation as having 2 chapters of letters to 7 churches, but I think a more natural reading is to say that the entire book of Revelation is the letter that is being sent to 7 churches. What we have in chapters 2 and 3 is not the letters. What we have in chapters 2 and 3 is a unique introduction written individually for each of the 7 churches that will be receiving this letter, the letter being the whole book. So the whole book itself, the whole book from beginning to end, is in apocalyptic style with a prophetic priority and method, and also as a statement of encouragement and challenge to churches, and therefore combining all 3 of these literary types. Many readers of Revelation find it simply mysterious, confusing, incomprehensible. So let's just break it down in terms of its most basic chunks. Chapter 1 is a vision of the resurrected Jesus, using different symbols to represent Christ's wisdom, Christ's word, Christ's sovereignty, and so on. Chapters 2 and 3, which are often called letters to the 7 churches, I've already suggested are 7 individualized introductions for the churches, so that when each of them receives this whole book as a letter to them, they hear themselves specifically addressed in terms of their own situations and needs. Then we have what most people think is the most confusing part of the book, and that's the bulk of it, chapters 4 through 19, which contain, sometimes in almost seemingly random order, a series of visions, different reports of heavenly worship, seals, trumpets, and bowls as the set of sets of 7 that are used, as sort of a framework for the rest of the book. In and among all of that, you have the two women, the bride and the harlot standing for Rome, the bride for Jerusalem, but both of these obviously referring not merely to physical earthly cities in the first century, but rather to the worldly kingdoms and the heavenly kingdom. And finally, in the last 3 chapters, we have rather straightforward and yet still symbolic descriptions of final judgment, of a new heaven, and of a new earth. So in terms of the basic outline of the book, apart from the fact that a large chunk of it seems quite difficult to outline, though that large section from 4 through 19, we still do see a sequence that works its way through the book. Having examined the basic outline of the book of Revelation, the next question is, what exactly do we do with all that material? What's it actually talking about? And here's where interpreters have come up with 4 primary approaches to the material. They're given technical terms: preterite, historical, futuristic, and symbolic. Let me just briefly say what each one means, and then we'll try and sort out what exactly we should do with this book. Those who hold to what's called the preterite school would argue that the book of Revelation was never intended to be a statement about world history, or a statement about the 20th or 21st century, or a statement about the future millennium, or the tribulation, or anything like that. It was intended always and only to be a symbolic description of what was really going on in the first century context of the writer and the readers. So, viewed that way, all the symbols within the book are interpreted in terms of first century realities. Beasts and false prophets are identified or are linked to characters within the first century, and so on. In other words, it's a book describing their world. A second approach has been called the historical one. In this view, it's not about the first century, it's about every century. And so as we work our way through the book of Revelation, we might, for example, find that in chapter 6, the author is using symbolic speech to talk about what's going on in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. As we work our way through chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, we're gradually working our way through church history, through the Dark Ages, through the Middle Ages, through the Enlightenment, on to the Reformation. And as we reach the latter parts of the book, eventually we're catching up to our own world. And so we see reflected in Revelation a previewing of world history, specifically church history in relation to its surrounding world and culture. That's a second approach. It's been very popular. One problem I can already mention with it is that from whatever vantage point the interpreter is looking, somehow that theirs always ends up being the last part of the book, as though the whole book is leading up to me, whether the me is standing in the 17th century or the 18th or the 19th or the 20th. That, in my mind at least, would call into doubt the method as a whole. It always is self-serving for the interpreter. I think it's also a problem that it almost always focuses on Western Europe and North America, as though God doesn't really care about the rest of the world. Well, many people have gone for a third option, which is called the futuristic approach. Future not only from the vantage point of the writer and the first readers, but future also from the vantage point of current readers. In other words, Revelation isn't about centuries 19 and 20. It's about century 21 and 22, if the Lord waits that long. It describes our future. Virtually everything in the book has yet to be fulfilled because we are not yet in the so-called end times. Many people will specifically locate chapter 4, verse 1 as the place where the author of Revelation is alluding to, for example, the rapture, where the seer is invited, come up here and I will show you things yet to come. And so after 4, verse 1 begins a description of what will happen after the church is whisked away to be with the Lord in heaven, and then we see the events of Revelation unfolding on earth. Fourth view, it was never intended to describe history at all, neither first century history nor the history of the church from the 1st to the 21st. nor the future. It's all symbol. It's symbolic description of the nature of salvation, of the nature of spiritual conflict, of the nature of heaven and hell. Don't link it to history, link it to how salvation looks and how we experience it. Well, quite a diversity. No wonder people talk past each other trying to interpret the book. If we're not even looking at the same world to find the clues as to what the symbols stand for, no wonder we're not finding the same message in the book. So what do we do with all that diversity? Some interpreters have said clearly each of these four has a share of plausibility to it, but taking the entire book as though it follows only one of those four will never work. And I think in that they are quite correct. You can't treat the whole book the same way. And so people have tried various kinds of combinations. So for example, chapter 1, the vision of Christ, is surely to be understood symbolically. Whatever Christ was like in the first century, that's what Christ is like today, and that's what Christ will be like tomorrow. So this vision is universal. It's not based on any one time period. So if there's four schools of thought and one of them is symbolic, let's go with that one for chapter 1. But then the question is, what about chapters 2 and 3, these so-called letters to the 7 churches? If these are 7 literal churches that existed in the first century, and the 2 chapters describe them, that would be the preterite interpretation. But some have said no, those 7 churches represent 7 different eras of church history, so that we should treat chapters 2 and 3 according to the historical school, but all the rest in terms of futuristic. In other words, chapters 2 and 3 are about churches in history. Chapter 4 through 19 are about what is yet to come after the rapture. Others have said that only chapters 4 through 19 are historical, describing eras of world history or church history. I'm not sure that any of these fully captures what's going on in Revelation, but I would tend towards a view that says chapter 1 is symbolic. It's about what Christ is really like. Chapters 2 and 3 are preterite. That is, these are real churches in the first century who needed to hear this message. What then are 4 through 19? Well, I think the symbols are taken from their world so as to understand how God is at work in the political systems, in salvation history, in the struggles that the church experiences. So in that sense it's preterite, but in another sense it's symbolic, for it shows the kinds of things that will characterize all of church history, no matter how long it lasts. But I doubt very much that we're supposed to look through those long chapters and plot them in connection with Western or European history. Finally, chapters 20 through 22 seem to do something new. There will be an accounting at the end of the age. And beyond that, the city of God coming down to be among us, and so on. So I would be inclined to view chapter 1 as symbolic, 2 and 3 as preterite, 20 through 22 as futuristic, though of course still using symbols to make the point, and the large section from 4 through 19 as a combination of both preterite and symbolic. That's at least one way of reading the text, and one that I think prevents one of the big dangers, and that is to use apocalyptic literature as though we can second guess what's going on in world history and predict the day of the coming of Christ, which I believe the scripture teaches us we can't do. One more issue to briefly discuss, and then we have one more slide where I will try to draw some of this together. And that is the reference to the millennium. You've perhaps heard millennium referred to not only in terms of the shift from the 1900s to 2000, but also in terms of biblical eschatology. There have been throughout church history 3 different views on what to do with that. First of all, the language comes from Revelation 20. It's really the only place in the entire Bible where a 1,000-year period of time is specifically talked about. Though many people would say, yes, it's only called a 1,000-year period in Revelation 20, but there are many, many texts throughout the Old Testament that refer to this time period. Well, that's quite debated. What exactly does Revelation 20 predict? Three views. One is that through the spread of Christianity around the world, when the gospel finally reaches all nations and penetrates all cultures, Jesus will use the missionary preaching of the gospel to bring in an era of unprecedented peace. This is called postmillennialism, meaning through the preaching of the gospel, the kingdom of peace is established and Christ's return is at the end of that period, post-millennium. This was a very popular view in the 18th century, in the 19th century even. But the 20th century kind of put a big dent in the popularity of this view, and people realized that despite all the advances in science and technology, the world really wasn't achieving any kind of universal peace or harmony. In fact, in many ways, the world was becoming even less a place where Christ's kingdom was being established. So that's postmillennialism. Let's go to the third one first. Premillennialism has been a view that's been popular at different times and is probably the most popular in evangelical circles today. And that is that the event which must precede and causes the millennium to begin is the return of Christ. Christ returns prior to a millennium. In fact, Christ returns precisely in order to establish a kingdom of peace on earth. And many would see that in a very literal sense. Christ returns, different views on whether there's a tribulation to follow, but ultimately Christ will come to set up a kingdom of peace on earth prior to yet another great event, and that is the final judgment and the eternity in which we will be with Christ or distant from Christ. So that's premillennialism. Then there have always been those that we call amillennialists, which literally means there isn't a millennium. Not quite the right title, because they would say, of course there is, it's just not a literal 1,000-year period. Rather, the millennium is a symbolic description of how God does come to establish salvation and peace in our hearts. Amillennialism means we are already now living under the lordship of Christ's kingdom through all of church history. So these have been three different views of the millennium that have been proposed at different times in church history, and you can probably see that it overlaps to some extent with the particular approaches that people use to the book of Revelation. Well, what do we do with all this diversity, all these options, and what seems to be a very great deal of unclarity? Let me make 5 points that I think capture what I think at least is most important in all this. For me, one of the first starting points is to recognize that in all of this kind of literature, apocalyptic literature, symbols are being used, symbols that made sense to the author and made sense to the readers. I think we simply need to be humble about the fact that sometimes we've lost the clues as to what those symbols meant for them. Sometimes they're drawn from the Old Testament, so we have access to them just as they did. But sometimes they're also drawn from their political and cultural world. And if in fact we can come up with clarity as to what those symbols mean, then it helps us understand the texts. If we can't, we simply need to be cautious and not propose all sorts of detailed meanings in texts where we really don't have certainty that that's what it's saying. So careful with symbols. Number 2, full literalism isn't possible, nor is it intended by the author. Those who would argue that the appropriate approach to the Bible is always to take it literally will in fact run into problems with that view all over the place, but in particular in apocalyptic literature, it was never intended to be taken literally. It was always intended to be taken as symbols. Christ doesn't literally have 7 swords coming out of his mouth. There is no woman who literally sits on 7 hills, as the author of Revelation describes it, and so on. These are symbols, so don't take them all literally, which of course raises the question, what exactly then do we take literally? Will Christ literally return at the end of the age? And my answer is yes. Just because the symbols are not to be taken literally doesn't mean that there's nothing literal about what it teaches. But of course, here we're required to discern carefully what is the primary message and what is the literary type used in order to present it. Point 3, one of the things that's troubled people is that the New Testament seems to say quite clearly that Jesus returns soon. Well, how long can it be and still be soon? In fact, the word that we often translate soon can just as well be translated quickly, as for example the King James Version does, "Behold, I come quickly." And quite literally, the word can mean when it starts to happen, it won't take long. So it doesn't necessarily have to imply it will be very soon, but it will be very quick. Now, the word itself does seem to imply soon also, but in their world, the word soon could have been used simply for a mark of certainty. It will indeed happen. In fact, for all we know, it could happen any time now. The technical term for that is imminent. It's imminent. And we understand imminent sometimes to mean it certainly won't be long now. But it's not quite that. It's more, it won't certainly be long. That is, it just might be now. And perhaps next year. Or maybe 50 years from now. Or another 2,000. We just don't know. But we can't count on delay anymore. That's what the word imminent means, and that in the New Testament is also what the word soon can be taken to mean. Point 4, events can have more than one level of fulfillment. We've seen that in Old Testament prophecy. Often an event finds a fulfillment in history, and then later Jesus comes along and fills the prophecy full or fuller. I think that's also true in the book of Revelation. There can be events in history that seem to be fulfillments of what the texts talk about, but that doesn't mean that this one event stands in one-to-one correspondence with what the text was saying. It might well be that that's simply one example of the text's truth, and there will be more, and at the end of the age we will see how those texts are filled right full. And finally, I do not believe that any text in the New Testament was intended to lead us to try to construct a calendar predicting the exact sequence and the timing of the end of the age. There are far too many clear warnings that we don't know, we can't know, we're not supposed to know. God intends for us not to know so that we will be faithful during the whole time of waiting. My basic view about the return of Christ is that the Bible teaches it could be at any time. If that's true, then Paul was supposed to believe it could be at any time. Martin Luther was supposed to believe it could be at any time. Every saint throughout church history is supposed to believe that. We're supposed to believe that. And if the Lord waits another few hundred years, our great-great-great-grandchildren are supposed to believe that. Nothing in world history can make us more certain or less certain that it's just around the corner now, because Jesus intended us not to know when. Someday, and it just might be today.